We're breaking tradition for the first time since Firing Line became a one-half-hour program by taping two programs successively with Barry Goldwater. Why? Well, on this program, it is the professional reasons that dominate. Firing Line isn't an interview program, nor a public meeting place for old friends. This doesn't mean that I intend to obscure a 30-year-old friendship with my guest, merely that we are not going to spend time discussing fishing and hunting expeditions we've taken together, which won't be hard since we've never gone hunting or fishing together. Though he did once fly me and my wife into the bowls of the Grand Canyon, which we survived. In fact, we've done a lot of sightseeing together from different cockpits. He, as the primary political activist in the United States, whose race for the presidency in 1964 forever changed the makeup of the Republican Party. George Will once put it that Barry Goldwater ran for the White House in 1964 and won it in 1980. His background is well known. Accordingly, I'll remind you only of this, that he left the Senate in January 1987 after 30 years' service to return to his home in Arizona, in which we are now sitting. His retirement is not, however, conventional. A year ago, he published his autobiography, Goldwater, his 10th book, if I count it right, including the all-time bestseller, The Conscience of the Conservative. I propose to devote the first half hour to taking a fix on issues that concerned conservatives in 1964, to ask how they look to us now, 25 years later. And the first of these is civil rights. My question, you voted with 21 other senators against the civil rights bill. Do you have reasons to regret that vote?
No, I've never regretted that vote because it was prompted by my questioning the constitutionality of two parts of it. One, the Supreme Court has voted on, and it's changed my opinion there. The other, I still agree with my vote that you have the right to rent your house to whoever you damn please. Black, white, green, or purple.
Well, when you say you changed your mind because the Supreme Court reinterpreted the Constitution, you anticipate something I intend to talk about a little bit later, but you don't allow the Supreme Court to make up your mind what the Constitution means, let alone what the Constitution ought to mean, do you?
No, I don't, and it never bothers me to that extent. If the Supreme Court makes a ruling, then that ruling is going to live, probably forever, on the question. So if I were in the Senate now and that same vote came up and the court had not ruled, I would vote the same way. But if the court had ruled, I don't know.
Well, now, suppose you were sitting in the Senate and you were persuaded that there was no constitutional objection to that Civil Rights Act. Would you vote for as much of it as, for instance, guarantees service to blacks at restaurants and at hotels, excluding only the business about renting your own house, or would you vote against the whole lot?
I would not have voted against the whole bill.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there are principles involved in a vote like that that still have to be answered. For example, our right of association. Now, nobody's ever passed a law saying that it would be illegal to belong to the Knights of Columbus or a Mason. However, that would enter in that question someday will probably pop up. I still believe that the First Amendment can be stretched all over the lot. I believe in the right of privacy. I want to do what I want to do as long as what I'm doing is not going to hurt you.
Well, but it is going to hurt me if I I'm driving late at night and I want a hot dog, and the store refuses to sell me one, isn't it? And anyway, that rubs against the old traditional common law that requires you to sell me something if I can pay for it. Did that affect your thinking on that at all?
No, because I was once a merchant, and I'd sell anything to anybody,
Mm-hmm.
as long as I got paid.
So, yeah. Well, when you were in the Senate, is it correct that you felt a lot of underground pressure from the merchants, places like Atlanta, to go ahead and pass the damn law so they could go ahead and sell to black customers without violating the taboos imposed by white people?
No, I think that's the first I've ever heard of
Is that
that.
right?
Nobody ever put the bee on me about that.
Well, is it your position that the Civil Rights Acts have been abused, for instance, by a reading of affirmative action very different from the reading that you understood you were voting on? I remember that Hubert Humphrey got up and he said, "I'll eat this bill if it's ever interpreted as discriminating against any white person." And yet affirmative action, as it is currently understood, has been upheld by the Supreme Court to say, in effect, if there are 30% Indians in this particular neighborhood, there ought to be 30% policemen who are Indians. Do you feel that that's been an abuse of what you voted on, or simply an accretion?
Let me make a broad statement. I think the Civil Rights Act has been broadly abused by both black and white. I think of the case of Richmond, Virginia, when they decided there had to be a certain number of blacks employed,
Yeah.
and the blacks didn't have the skill to be employed. So construction pretty much stopped. And I believe that we have that constant group of people, like we have groups of people in every conceivable subject that comes up, constantly looking for ways to keep the term civil rights alive. I think the Civil Rights Bill has done a good job. I think there's been abuses, and there'll continue to be abuses.
By people who tend to give it fanatical expression.
That's right. Well, it's hard to pick up a paper that doesn't show hundreds of people gathered in Washington, D.C. for this cause or that cause or some other cause that's out here. We've never heard of it. Thank God.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of causes that are more local, what about civil rights and the whole question of immigration? The McCarran-Walter Act specifically said there is a culture in America of historic origins, primarily dominated by West Europeans, and we feel no obligation to ignore that culture by paying equal attention to applicants for immigration, irrespective of their ethnic background, which was a polite way of saying against what the Oriental Exclusion Act had once said, only it was much more broad-minded than that. Do you think there's any call for continuing a concern for the historical background of the American, or should a Mexican, say, have absolutely equal?
No, the Simpson Act that was passed a few years ago while I was in the Senate has allowed millions of Mexican Americans to come and live in this country. Now, I've spent my life here on the border, and I think the Mexican is a wonderful person. I think we could use probably more, although they're growing to the extent that they're going to dominate the politics of our border states. Not tomorrow, but they will. In fact, I understand that by the year 2000, in California, there will be more Asian languages and Spanish spoken than English. Now, there's no question throughout our history. Not law, but broad exclusion, if you want to use that word, of the law. We've attracted people here from all over the world. My grandfather was a Pole, and I don't think it's hurt America, but we may be getting to the point where we're going to have a domination, say, of Asians, maybe, of Spanish, of Mexicans, maybe. Will that be good or bad?
Well, but isn't the question to ask, will their grandchildren be as palpably American as you are? They won't look the way you look, but will their ways be American? Will their traditions be American? Or will they bring in a culture that is in some sense hostile to the culture that your grandfather was willing to surrender in exchange for a different culture?
Well, having said what I have said on this, I'm not worried. I find the Asian people who have come to my state to be very, very loyal, dedicated Americans. We've had 5 Medal of Honor winners in my state. 3 of them have been Mexicans. We don't draft Mexicans, they volunteer. So right now, I'm not worried about what we've been talking
But when you
about.
when you say they dominate the politics of Arizona, you got to be saying in opposition to whoever used to dominate the politics of Arizona. Therefore, you're setting up a difference between the way they tend to vote and the way others tend to vote. How does that express itself, that difference?
Well, Bill, that's another subject, and the politics in this nation is changing. Without the dominance of people, of a particular race or creed or color, if anything, I think it's going to help the politics of America. It's pretty hard for me to explain that, not being an active politician anymore, but having lived with in a state where we have a large concentration of people who moved from Mexico, the way they vote has been very good for us. The Indians, and we have about 1/3 of the Indians living in this state, they don't tend to vote. They don't respect the white man yet, and I don't think they ever will. So it's a subject that I haven't really given a lot of thought to, but I can say real quickly that any way they can change this political system is not going to be harmful.
But you would vote in favor of requiring them to learn English, wouldn't you?
Oh, yes. Yes, I have been chairman of the committee in this state to require English spoken. It passed. And what the trouble we're having now is to convince the Mexican who has not learned English that the only thing we're talking about is they have to use English when they're in a court or when they're talking before any legal body. So I'm not worried about that. I think we should. In fact, I'd like to see my children in Arizona begin learning to speak Spanish when they're 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah, right.
Once you know 2 languages, the rest aren't too bad.
Well, let's switch to a major theme of our 1964 preoccupation, which was the Soviet Union. There are all kinds of indications that objective reality has caught up with Marxism, and that this is forcing the Soviet Union in a direction which we always wanted to push it. But it hasn't forced it to the point of causing them to disarm effectively. They're more powerful now than they were before we signed the INF Treaty.
Right.
Now, are you persuaded that they have abandoned their historical calling because reality has caught up with them, or do you feel that we have to guard against the possibility that they may be simply putting that aside opportunistically until they can revive that ambition?
I believe we should always be on the alert. I don't care whether it's Russia or any other country. We cannot just sit back and say, peace is here, let's forget about defense. Now, what's happening in the Soviet Union, and being an amateur radio operator, I get to talk to these people, not a lot, but...
I know you got a pen pal on that ham radio of
That's
yours.
right. The trouble in the Soviet Union today is economic. The young people, I'm talking about 18, 20, 25, 30 years old, are very unhappy that they have to work 2 or 3 weeks to buy a pair of shoes, or that they can't have more than one radio, or maybe not even one. And when you get a group of young people, I don't care whether it's Russia or the United States or where, even China, when you get young people trying to earn a living and they're not allowed to use the full asset that they have, they're not allowed to keep the money that they earn, they're either going to have to change their economic system, which is now socialist, to a free economy or a freer economy, or they're going to have a revolution. Now, I must say I've been trying to go visit Gorbachev for quite a while, but as you might imagine, the Russians have never wanted to give me a visa to even look at the country, because when the war was over, I was probably the most, next to you, the most vehement anti-communist living. I'm still trying to just go over and shake his hand, look him in the eye, and then come home. Because I have a feeling that this man knows that the teaching of Lenin are no good anymore. And we're watching it in other countries around the world that have been trying it. They're giving it up. They're turning more and more towards a free system. You can look, the best example I can give are the 35, 40,000 Chinese that Chiang Kai-shek moved over onto the island of Formosa that we now call Taiwan. They now have, I think, the 7th biggest gross national product in the world, and they're the 4th biggest supplier of dollars to the United States. And yet poverty exists on mainland China.
Yeah.
And if they ever get rid of communism in Red China, I'll give China 20, 25 years, and they're going to lead the world.
Well, so somebody remarked in France recently that the only Marxists left were in American universities. And
You brought that
may
up.
Be, that may be correct, but it's also true that if he has given up Lenin, Gorbachev, he's not acting exactly in an anti-Leninist way.
No.
For instance, here they are, they're broke. They can't feed, clothe, house their own people. But in the first 6 months of this year, they've sent armaments into Afghanistan while they were simultaneously marching out at the rate of $3 billion a year.
Yeah.
Now, something has to have motivated something of that kind. Do you think some sort of an ultimatum is appropriate by the West in terms of economic credit?
I don't know if I'm ready to say yes to that or not. What's been going on in Afghanistan is a repetition of history that goes back to Genghis Khan, and nobody ever bothers those Afghans and gets away with it. I remember in World War II, when I was stationed in India, I flew a P-38 over Afghanistan one day, and it'd make our Grand Canyon look like the plains of Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
So the general said, take the Jeep and go over. What the hell I want to do that for, but I did. And they're an unusually strong people. They remind me of the Westerners. They'll fight like hell for their back 40. And that's what the Soviet Union's run into. Now, I can't give you an answer as to why Gorbachev hasn't removed all of the troops, as to why there's still fighting going on down there, or why we're still involved in it.
But you do think that we should put pressure on him to
I
pull
do.
out and formally repeal the Brett-Smith doctrine?
You asked the question about economic pressure. I don't know how much real good our economic assistance has been where we've tried to use it to affect the Soviet Union or their decisions. Now, you mentioned that he has not broken away completely from Lenin.
Yeah.
You don't do that any more than we would expect ourselves to do away with the thoughts that prompted our fight for freedom overnight. But I do think, as old as I am, I'm going to live to see the day when there's a more or less, or put it another way, a freer economic system in the Soviet Union than they had today.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I get back to this point, the young people aren't going to stand for it.
I suppose we can't expect them to break away from Lenin as fully as, say, the Supreme Court has broken away from the Bible, right? Speaking of which, most people tracking your record as a conservative are surprised by that one point that in 1964 you were rather defiantly opposed to the excesses of Earl Warren, the so-called Warren Court, who was finding always for the defendant and finding odd little corners of the Constitution in which he could assert his social philosophy. But so is it said about you that along the lines you made your peace with the Supreme Court and decided that you would stop expressing your irritation over some of their findings. Well, how would you comment on that?
Well, that's not exactly true. I knew Earl Warren for many, many years before he went to the court. I always knew him as a man who leaned to the left, who would embrace more of the Democratic philosophy than he would the Republican. And that was true when he became leader of the court.
Is it true when Tom Dewey named him vice presidential candidate?
That's right. I oppose that. Now, the court today, while I don't jump up and down with joy about every decision, I think on the whole, our Constitution and our way of life is far safer under this group than they have been or would have been had we continued a long line of Democratic presidents. That's my feeling. And I think that this court, and I shouldn't say this, but some of those people are getting older. And if they should unfortunately pass away and a Republican president makes a more or less conservative appointment, I think we can banish the fear of damage to our Constitution for a long time.
I remember asking a guide in Seville 25 years ago after the sudden death of Cardinal Segura, who was a pretty fanatical cardinal. He'd forbidden people to dance a week or so before he died. I said, well, what's life like under Cardinal Segura? He said, well, put it this way. Since the death of Cardinal Segura, he and we passed on into a better world. That's the way you feel about...
somebody's watching them.
about what might happen if certain people retire from the Supreme Court. But I guess the question people are wondering about Goldwater is, to what extent do you think it's correct for a conservative to have fidelity to the court? Let me give you an example. George McGovern, just after he accepted his nomination, was asked at a press conference, how do you feel about compulsory busing? He said, well, the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on that yet. That wasn't the question. They were asking him how he felt about it. And I could understand it saying, well, if the court rules that it's okay, I got to go along, even though I oppose it. Or I could understand it saying, I'm for it, whatever the Supreme Court says.
Mm-hmm.
But don't you think it's dangerous to allow the Supreme Court to act as your moral dictator?
Oh, I don't think we should ever do that.
No, we shouldn't do that. But a lot of people do.
I think the Supreme Court is a guide when there's a question about the relationship of a piece of legislation or existing law to the Constitution. They're the only body we have that can say yes or no. We don't have to sit back and say, I accept that. We can raise hell about it. It may not help, but I think it has its effect.
Well, do you give up, as a practical matter, the prospect of ever overturning a decision by constitutional amendment? Because it's been since the income tax law that's been done.
You've asked a very touchy question.
Like the flag burning,
let's see, talking about that, all this furor we've gone through about what we do about men who spit on the flag or burn the flag, and there are those who want to amend the Constitution. Now, my great fear about amending the Constitution in these days is that you wind up with a constitutional convention, and then Sadie locked the door. Because once they start a convention, they undoubtedly will try to rewrite many parts of the Constitution that many people in our country find untenable.
But it would have to be passed by 3/4 of the state.
That's right, but we have that danger, and I don't like that. That's why I support the simple law that says a man destroys the flag, he's subject to a fine and a term in jail. We don't have to have a constitutional amendment or the dangers of a constitutional amendment to get that.
We'll leave it at that for this week. Thank you, Senator Goldwater. I'll see you in just a little while.
Roger.
Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Farley Industries Incorporated, Monarch Financial Services Incorporated, Payne Weber, and the Friends of Firing Line.